Like, what even is a president? What can they even do? Well, it's funny you should ask that on today of all days, because today we're going to be talking about the office of the President of the United States of America. Presidency is a bit nuts, being the most important position in the world, but I would be happy to give you a brief overview of it. Welcome to a brief overview where we run through an expansive topic as fast as physically possible, kind of. Today that sprint is going to take us to an understanding of the US presidency, or at least an understanding of what the founding fathers wanted the presidency to look like. We're also going to be making frequent comparisons with the US's northern neighbor because they operate under a different system, and we'll follow the careers of President Green and Prime Minister Blue, the leaders of their respective countries. So what's a president, and how is President Green's role different from Prime Minister Blue's? Well, all a president is the chief executive of a government. That's it. Just the face and voice of an entire nation, nothing huge, definitely not a ton of responsibility. In fact, ideally, it shouldn't be a ton of responsibility. It should be the most boring job in the world, because a president is #1 bureaucrat in a world of politicians. Which kind of sounds like a nightmare. Democracies tend to be made up of 3 different branches: legislature, executive, and courts. The legislature writes the laws, the executive carries out the laws, and the courts interpret the laws. It seems pretty straightforward, but also, what does it mean? How do you carry out a law? Why do laws need to be interpreted? On his first day in office, Prime Minister Blue, leader of the Blue Party in Canada, decided he wanted all the laws in Canada to be blue, because that's the platform his party had run on. As a sitting member of the legislature, he introduced a bill that said all laws must be blue, which was subsequently passed because it was so uncontroversial. Then that bill was a law. Mr. Blue, as chief executive, because he was the head of the cabinet, which is the executive body in Canada, had that law plopped down onto his desk, where he decided the best way to carry out that law was to hire blue officers to walk around the neighborhoods, give tickets to anyone that didn't have a blue lawn. Somebody got a ticket for not having a blue lawn, but he thought that his lawn was blue, so he took that ticket to court. In the court, color was legally declared subjective, and lawns only had to be blue according to the perception of the said lawn's owner. And people stopped painting their lawns blue because blue paint was expensive and it kept washing off. On President Green's first day in office, he decided he wanted all American lawns to be green. It's the natural color of grass, and also, again, the platform he had run on, most green parties run on the platform of lawns being green. So very, very expected. Problem was, as President Green soon recognized, he was part of the executive and not the legislature because he was in America. So he couldn't actually make any laws, and then he went and made some pizza rolls because he was hungry, and then after his snack, he decided to actually check Article 2 and see what powers he had as the president. President Green discovered that the office of the president only really had 5 useful constitutionally embedded powers. He could veto bills brought to him by Congress. He could make treaties with foreign nations. He could command the military. He could make a State of the Union address. And he could appoint people to the government offices. So perhaps he had more options for turning every American lawn green, but it wasn't quite the same as Prime Minister Blue. The difference between parliamentary and presidential systems is that in presidential systems, the executive and the legislature are separate. This is to create a check on each branch's power, so that no one group could make drastic laws that the general public might not agree with. Parliamentary systems have the executive contained within the legislature so that the government is more efficient at writing and carrying out laws because the same people that write them carry them out, and there's not really a conflict between the two bodies. The US Constitution is kind of amazing in a couple of ways because of this split in power. The first is simply the fact that it does split the power, a concept that was not really executed in a government before the US and that has been copied countless times since. The second is that this check on power is constitutionally embedded. It's not a suggestion, it's a basis for the whole existence of the government. It took a group of people to not give themselves power over the whole country, and that restraint means that nutjobs that get elected today in any office in the US have to work much, much harder to get lawns made green than they would have if the executive and the legislature were one body. That doesn't mean it's impossible, and President Green didn't win office because he gave up easily, so he started studying what exactly each of his constitutional powers meant. The veto is a direct check on the power of Congress. The people's representative, the president, can say no if they don't think a bill represents the will of the people. It's designed to be wholly reactive. The president can't use it to further their own aims. They can only use it to say no to Congress. But this isn't entirely true because the president can use the power of veto to force compromise. For instance, if Congress wants all houses to be red, President Green can say he'll only sign that bill into law if they also include that all lawns must be green. As the head of state, the president also is the one that makes treaties with foreign nations. There are a wide variety of treaties that exist, and all it really means is that the countries agree on something. That can be anything from recognizing the sovereignty of a third nation to settling trade routes between the two. Doesn't really help President Green in his quest to turn American lawns green, but it did spark a dream to turn all lawns around the world green, and this particular power may help him achieve that. It was around this time that President Green discovered he was the commander-in-chief of the American military. He figured he could declare war on non-green lawns and order the Army, Navy, and Air Force to march all over, turning lawns green. Unfortunately for President Green, he couldn't actually do this, because despite being the constitutional commander-in-chief, the president doesn't have the power to declare war. That power falls to Congress. It's another check of the president's power. The Founding Fathers didn't want one person to be able to both declare war and command the soldiers that would be fighting in that war. Sneaky little trick that past presidents discovered is that they could still order troops around even if war had not been declared. In fact, the last time the US declared war, it was WW2, which, if you know anything about US history, is not the last armed conflict they've been a part of, or started, or ended, or tried to end. So President Green figured he could issue an order as commander-in-chief to have the military turn all American lawns green, but he figured that might meet with some public backlash, possibly a couple 100,000 lawsuits, so he figured he'd use it as a somewhat drastic plan B. The power to make appointments. This is a curious power because it involves vesting power in other people. The most important appointment is that of Supreme Court judges, which is important because 1, they are the highest court in the country, and as the highest court, their judgments can't be overturned by anyone, including the government. And 2, the appointments are for life, so once the decision is made, it sticks. Appointing a Supreme Court judge is important, but not every president has the chance to make such an appointment, because there's not always a vacant seat during a president's time in office. The Supreme Court is the most important appointment, but it is far from the only one. And as chief bureaucrat, the president has to choose all of the people that command the various offices that aid him in carrying out the laws that he signs. So President Green could create a Department of Green Lawns and appoint a head of that department, but they would not carry the force of any law, and they would have no funding because Congress controls the budget. I'll say that once more, Congress controls the budget. Another check on the chief bureaucrat, the president, is that they don't decide how much money government departments get. The hilarious part is that the budget is still a bill, so the president must sign it into law, which is cause for a lot of conflict between the legislature and the executive. If the US government has ever shut down during your lifetime, this is why. Congress writes a budget, the president says, nah, I hate that budget. Congress says, screw you, old man, and then the government doesn't know what to pay everybody, and they shut down. So appointing people isn't really going to help President Green on his quest for green laws, which leaves our newly inaugurated president one more option, the State of the Union Address. Now back in the day, this referred to the actual State of the Union Address, where the president gave a speech to everyone in Congress, both the Senate and the House, and appealed them on policy positions, or, whatever. The fun part of the State of the Union was that it was highly publicized, so whatever the president brought up would be talked about by the general public for weeks to come. If he said something like, the Speaker of the House is a dum-dum, then papers and news outlets would spend weeks going, the Speaker really is a dum-dum, or is the Speaker a dum-dum? And then the Speaker of the House would inevitably respond saying, hey, nah, not a dum-dum. And something that wasn't an issue before was suddenly thrust into the limelight because the president had brought it up. Nowadays, the president can do that any day of the year on whatever platform they so choose. All the State of the Union Address represents is the fact that the president is the sole representative of every citizen in America. Every other office that gets voted for is a subsection of the population, whereas the president is voted for by everyone, and so they can sway public opinion as the people's representative. This is also where presidents get a bit more dicey, because the more popular the president, the more power they have. Say Congressman Tony Stark doesn't want legislation regarding lawns at all. The incredibly popular President Green calls him out for it. Well, that congressman goes up for election sooner than the president, his term is only 2 years, and his constituents may not want a congressman who disagrees with the president to represent them anymore. So really the most powerful tool a president has is public attention. Now it's around this time that President Green remembers 2 things. The first is that he won 100% of the vote, so he could make a plea to the public to pressure their representatives in the House and Senate to legislate on the color of lawns, and he could probably achieve his policy goal. The other thing he remembers is that his idol as a child was President Theodore Roosevelt, who made an interesting discovery. The discovery was that Article 2 in the Constitution stated that the executive power rested in the president's office, so he could just make orders and people would have to listen to them. These became known as executive orders and are pretty controversial to this day. Executive orders carry the full force of the law behind them. Even though they're essentially just laws written by one person, the president, and then signed by that same person, it's suddenly a law. It's pretty much exactly what the Founding Fathers did not want happening, but the difference between an executive order and a real law is that any president that comes after can simply abolish it, just write it out in another executive order. So if you want policy to stick, it's probably a better idea to push it through Congress. And constitutionally, that's it. That's all. If President Green can't figure out a way to use one of those powers to further his grass-centric agenda, then legally, he's out of luck. The reality is, of course, that the US is still an economic and military powerhouse on a global scale, and that position as a country affords the president power over perception. I guarantee lawn care companies had their stocks triple in value on the night of President Green's election for no other reason than people perceived a shift in policy that would make those lawn care companies more valuable. The other reality is that trade and globalization are more and more important in the modern world, and so being the face of a nation to foreign powers is a huge role. And since American economy and military has such a huge effect on the global economy, the commander-in-chief wields huge power. While considering options for the nuances of green lawn policy, the people of America realize that they live in a country whose existence is based on the ability to choose what color lawn you have, and they're not going to let some monocolor elitist take that away from them. They pressured their representatives and senators, and soon impeachment is started. Impeachment is a surprisingly simple procedure, and it is what's used to remove a president from office. First, the House of Representatives must pass a vote on the impeachment, which is a simple 50-50 vote. If more than 50% of representatives vote for impeachment, it passes. And if it passes, the Senate must move to convict or not. The Senate vote requires 2/3 of the Senate to vote for conviction, which is why even starting impeachment is quite rare, because getting 2/3 of the Senate to agree on anything is extremely difficult. If a president is impeached but not convicted, they remain in office. If a president is successfully removed from office, their vice president takes over, and since the two tend to have similar platforms and are from the same party, likely very little policy-wise would change. There's not yet been a case of a president being both impeached and convicted. Johnson, Clinton, and Trump were impeached but not convicted, and Nixon resigned before official votes were cast, but almost certainly would have been both impeached and convicted. So, Congress successfully impeaches and convicts President Green, and our fateful politician is booted from office. Lawn care stocks plummet, tens of businesses go bankrupt, and ex-President Green becomes the martyr of a dying industry. His vice president, 100-year-old blind man, takes over and successfully cures world hunger. I will briefly note that the vice president has essentially no constitutional power and is pretty much entirely a figurehead, but for many years the vice presidency has been considered a stepping stone to the presidency, which is why you see so many VPs become Ps. Before signing off, I wanted to clarify something about the Canadian executive because I glanced over it so briefly. The head of the executive in Canada is officially still the Queen of England, who is represented by the Governor-General, who is advised by the Prime Minister, who leads the cabinet. This is another figurehead position. The Governor-General, or Queen for that matter, would not deal with executive matters in Canada because they are not elected representatives. Another difference between presidential and parliamentary systems that you may have noticed is that in a parliamentary system, or at least the one in Canada, citizens don't all get to vote for a single position. You vote for your member of parliament, but you don't get any say in your executive. So that's, a fact now. So there's a brief overview of the president's office. If your first thought at this point is, wait a second, that seems so little. Isn't there way more to the presidency? Aren't you going to talk about, presidents? At this point, I will point to two words in the title, brief and overview, and say, yes, there is way more to the presidency, and no, I will not be talking about specific presidents, because there are a lot of presidents, and a lot of very influential presidents. If you want to look at past leaders that have greatly changed the role of the president's office, I would urge you to look into the life of Teddy Roosevelt, who embodies the do first, ask for permission from Congress later approach to the role. In fact, if this episode has sparked any questions or interest, please look further. The history of the presidency is fascinating and well documented, so don't hesitate to do some reading, or watching or listening, or however else you can consume information. But in the meantime, thank you for listening to this podcast, and I hope you'll stop by for the next one.